It was a typical day, and the sounds of revving motorcycles echoed through the street. A group of bikers, known for their rowdy behavior, spotted a woman sitting in a wheelchair at the corner of the park. They saw an easy target, someone they could mess with, maybe have a laugh at her expense. What they didn't know was that this was no ordinary woman. Behind her calm exterior, hidden beneath the quiet demeanor, was someone far more dangerous than they could ever imagine. As the bikers began to close in, underestimating her, something dark shifted in her eyes. Her hands, though resting on the wheels, had a grace that hinted at a past life filled with deadly skills. What they thought would be a harmless encounter quickly turned into a nightmare for them. But who was she really? And why was she in a wheelchair? Stay tuned, because this is a story you won't want to miss. Years ago, she wasn't in a wheelchair. She was one of the most feared assassins in the world, known only by a code name that struck terror into the hearts of those who heard it. Her missions were flawless, her movements precise, and her ability to vanish without a trace became legendary. But something went terribly wrong. A botched operation, an unexpected betrayal, and a bullet that shattered everything. Now, confined to a wheelchair, she was left to pick up the pieces of a life she thought was over. The bikers, clueless about her past, had no idea what they were dealing with. As they circled closer, laughing and taunting her, she could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins, just like it had back in her prime. The reflexes she once relied on, though dulled by time, still lingered beneath the surface. The wheelchair, a symbol of weakness to them, was only a temporary hindrance. What happens next? That's what they would soon find out if they survived the encounter. The bikers, sensing her tension, leaned in closer, unaware that their taunts had pushed her to a breaking point. Their leader, a burly man with tattoos covering his arms, sneered at her, certain she was no threat. "What's the matter, sweetheart? Can't even walk? Guess you'll just sit there like the helpless little." Before he could finish, her fingers gripped the wheels of her chair, a sudden movement so fast, it barely registered to anyone but her. The wheelchair's brakes clicked off with a sharp snap. The cold metal beneath her hands seemed to pulse with energy as she shifted her body, leaning forward, calculating each biker's position in an instant. But then something unexpected happened. The youngest of the group, a wiry teenager with a nervous twitch, hesitated. His eyes met hers, and for just a second, he saw something in her gaze that made the hairs on his neck stand up. He froze, unsure whether he should retreat or stick with his gang. The leader noticed the hesitation and barked, "What are you waiting for? She's just a cripple." Yet the young man couldn't shake the feeling. There was more to her than her condition. A lingering doubt gnawed at him, but he couldn't put his finger on it. The woman's eyes shifted briefly toward him, her lips curling into a slight, knowing smile. She saw the fear, the uncertainty. He wasn't like the others. But the tension in the air thickened as she realized she was outnumbered, surrounded by men who would stop at nothing to assert their dominance. And yet, despite being out of the game for so long, she was still a deadly force. The bikers couldn't have known it, but they were playing with fire. The question was, would they back off before they got burned, or would they push her too far? The standoff grew heavier. The bikers, sensing something was off but unsure what, exchanged uneasy glances. Their leader, trying to assert control, reached down for a knife hidden in his boot. The cold blade glinted in the afternoon sun as he stepped forward, snarling. "You think you're some kind of tough girl in that chair?" He spat. "This ain't a movie. This is real life, and you're about to learn the hard way." But the young man, the one who had hesitated, stepped back slowly. His hand hovered near his own pocket, his mind racing. There was something in the way she moved, in the sharpness of her eyes, that he couldn't ignore. His instincts were screaming at him to run, to stop this before it went too far. But the leader was not about to back down. You with me or against me. The leader barked at him, the knife now fully drawn. The young man's heart hammered in his chest. He glanced at the woman, who was now completely still, almost as if she were waiting. Then, without warning, she shifted again, just slightly, but it was enough. The chair moved forward with such velocity that it took the bikers by surprise. The leader lunged, but the woman was faster. In a blur, she spun the chair, knocking his hand away, the knife skittering across the pavement. Her leg moved in an almost unnatural arc, a swift kick that landed square in his chest, sending him stumbling backward. The other bikers hesitated, shocked by the sudden violence. Their eyes widened as they realized just how outmatched they were. But the leader, recovering quickly, reached for a second weapon, this time a gun. The metal clicked into place, and the world seemed to hold its breath. She hadn't moved. Not yet. Her body tensed, her fingers subtly adjusting the wheels again. She could hear the sounds of her heartbeat, steady but sharp in her ears. The moment was coming. The choice was clear: fight or risk being overrun by these men who had underestimated her from the start. But the question lingered in the air. Would she go that far? Would she pull the trigger, or would something stop her? The gun's cold barrel pointed directly at her chest, and for a split second, the world seemed to freeze. The leader's eyes burned with rage, but there was a flicker of something else, fear, or perhaps doubt. Her calmness unnerved him. He could feel the tension in the air, thick enough to suffocate. Then, just as he prepared to squeeze the trigger, a sound broke the silence. A low, rumbling growl that echoed from the alley behind them. Before anyone could react, a massive figure stepped into the street, blocking the sunlight. It was a man, tall and built like a boulder, but there was something off about his presence. His face was partially hidden by a thick hood, and his movements were too fluid, too deliberate to be a normal bystander. His eyes locked onto the group with a predatory intensity. The bikers froze. It wasn't just the size of the man that made them uneasy. It was the overwhelming sense that they weren't dealing with ordinary people anymore. The leader hesitated, lowering the gun slightly, unsure whether to stay focused on the woman or face this new threat. The woman, however, didn't flinch. Her mind was working fast, calculating the new danger, as she sensed the arrival of something, or someone, that could either be an ally or another adversary. The man's presence threw her off balance for just a moment, but only enough to make her question her next move. And then, without warning, the figure spoke in a voice so low and calm it sent a chill down the spine of everyone present. "You don't want to do this," he said, his words piercing the air with chilling certainty. The bikers, now caught between two unpredictable forces, were visibly rattled. What was happening? Who was this man? Was he with her, or was he something far worse? The silence stretched, thick with anticipation. In that instant, everything hung in the balance. The woman, the bikers, and the mysterious figure. Each of them faced a choice that could change everything. But the question remained: who would strike first? The tension in the air was unbearable. The leader, still holding the gun, shifted his aim between the woman and the mysterious figure, trying to make sense of the situation. His hand trembled, but he refused to show weakness. The young biker, who had hesitated earlier, stood frozen, his eyes darting between them. The man in the hood took a slow step forward, his posture almost predatory, and his voice dropped to a whisper. "This ends now." The leader, desperate, snarled, "Stay back, or I'll." But before he could finish his threat, the hooded figure moved faster than anyone expected. In a blur, he reached out and grabbed the gun, twisting it from the leader's hand with a swift, brutal motion. The biker scrambled, but it was clear they were no match for him. In one fluid motion, the mysterious figure shoved the leader backward, sending him crashing into the pavement. The rest of the bikers, now panicked, backed off, realizing they had crossed a line they weren't prepared to deal with. The woman in the wheelchair didn't move, still calculating every second, every detail. But she knew this moment well, the exact moment when someone else's plan disrupted her own. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. She had a choice now. The bikers were out of the picture for the moment, but the man in the hood, he was something else. Something more dangerous. As he turned toward her, she finally allowed herself to speak. "Who are you?" His eyes flickered for a moment, as if considering whether to reveal the truth. Then he smiled, a cold, knowing smile. "I'm the one who's been watching you. Your past never truly left you, did it?" Suddenly, everything clicked. The voice, the mannerisms, it wasn't just coincidence. She hadn't been forgotten after all. This wasn't just some stranger stepping in to save her. It was someone from her past, someone who knew far too much about her history. But just as she opened her mouth to ask more, the man reached into his coat and pulled out a small device, pressing a button. The air around them seemed to hum with an electric pulse. Before she could react, everything went black. The last thing she heard before the world faded was his voice, distant and almost regretful. "You were always my greatest asset. It's time you remembered why." And then nothing. The mysteries of her past, the life she thought she'd left behind, it all began to unravel once more. When the woman finally regained consciousness, she found herself in a sterile, dimly lit room. Her hands were no longer resting on the wheelchair's wheels. The once familiar feeling of being in control now felt distant, almost like a memory she could barely grasp. The man in the hood stood before her, his posture calm, almost patient. "I never wanted you to forget," he said quietly. "You were the best. But now you've become a liability." Her heart raced as the pieces fell into place. The betrayal, the mission that went wrong, the years of hiding, it all made sense now. She wasn't just an assassin anymore. She was a pawn in a much larger game, one she had thought she'd escaped. But this time, she wouldn't be manipulated again. With a swift motion, she reached for a hidden blade, one she had kept from her past. As the man moved to stop her, she acted faster than he could react. In the end, it wasn't just about survival. It was about reclaiming the life that was stolen from her. As the man crumpled to the floor, she took a deep breath, the weight of the past lifting for the first time in years. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. She wasn't anyone's pawn anymore. The woman who had once been forgotten was back, and she was going to make sure no one ever underestimated her again.